translate this and my salary is yours." The room went silent for a moment, then burst into laughter. The millionaire leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes sparkling with arrogance, certain that his words were an impossible challenge. He wasn't just offering money. He was offering his entire salary, an amount that could change someone's life overnight. But to him, it was a joke, a game, a performance designed to humiliate, and his laughter filled the air like thunder. Everyone around chuckled nervously except one person. The maid, standing by the corner of the room with her hands neatly folded, didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze steady, as though she'd just been invited into a secret she already knew the answer to. The millionaire didn't notice her silence at first. He was too busy feeding off the chuckles of his audience, too busy basking in the glow of his own confidence. But then, like a ripple across still water, the laughter died down. The air shifted. Someone muttered, "She's going to try." And that's when he turned his eyes toward her. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. The maid didn't move. She repeated softly but clearly, "I'll translate it." And for a heartbeat, the millionaire's smirk faltered. Now, before we dive deeper, let me say this. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or laughed at because of who you are or where you come from, this story will feel like a mirror. It's not just about language. It's not just about translation. It's about courage, knowledge, and the quiet power of those who are never expected to shine. And trust me, you'll want to stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will leave you completely stunned. The room leaned forward, as if the maid's words had turned gravity itself in her favor. Even the chandelier seemed to sway closer, catching golden glimmers of light across her face. She stepped into the center, not with arrogance, not with showmanship, but with calm certainty. Every step was measured, every breath steady, as though this moment had been waiting for her all along. The millionaire chuckled again, though now his voice wavered with a thin edge of doubt. "Do you even know what it means?" he asked, waving his hand dismissively. "Translation isn't a trick. It's an art. And I'm not talking about your everyday phrases. I'm talking about something deep, layered, nuanced. Something you can't possibly—" "Say it," she interrupted. The crowd gasped. No one interrupted the millionaire. Not in his house. Not in his presence. But she did. And the silence that followed was so sharp it could have been cut with glass. He raised his eyebrows, half amused, half annoyed, but he obliged. He repeated the phrase slowly, dragging out the words as if to emphasize their weight. "Translate this, and my salary is yours." She nodded once. Then she began. But here's the thing, what she did wasn't just a translation of words. She translated meaning. She transformed arrogance into understanding, laughter into awe. Each sentence that rolled from her tongue wasn't mechanical. It was alive. And within seconds, people stopped seeing her as just the maid. They started seeing her as something else entirely. A force. And you're about to witness exactly how she flipped the script. Before I continue, do me a quick favor. If you're already hooked by this story, if you're curious about what the maid said, how she said it, and why it shattered the millionaire's ego, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button so more people can find this story, and drop a comment with your guess. What do you think she said? Because your comment might just predict the twist that's coming. Alright, back to the story. The millionaire crossed his arms, still trying to look in control, but his jaw tightened. He expected stuttering, fumbling, maybe even an embarrassing failure. But the maid's voice was fluid, confident, almost melodic. She wasn't just repeating words. She was unlocking them, revealing layers that even he hadn't considered. It was as if she was holding up a mirror, not of his wealth, but of his ignorance. Each word cut deeper into his pride. Each phrase reminded him that brilliance doesn't come dressed in designer suits or with bank accounts lined with zeros. Sometimes brilliance wears a uniform, carries a tray, and waits patiently in the corner until the perfect moment arrives. By the time she finished, the room was silent. No laughter, no mocking smiles, just wide eyes and dropped jaws. And the millionaire? He couldn't even speak. His laughter had vanished, replaced with something raw, something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. And that, my friends, was just the beginning. The maid's words still lingered in the air, echoing like a secret melody no one had expected to hear. The guests looked at each other, unsure of how to process what had just happened. Some tried to smile, others whispered nervously, but most simply stood frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. It was as if the very foundation of the evening had shifted, as if the ground beneath the millionaire's feet was suddenly unstable. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Impressive," he muttered, though his tone lacked the certainty it usually carried. "But you probably memorized a phrase or two. That doesn't mean you understand." The maid met his eyes, unshaken. "Ask me something else," she said. The audacity of her words rippled through the crowd. No one dared to challenge the millionaire, let alone invite him to test them further. But here she was, standing tall, her voice steady, her presence magnetic. The millionaire leaned forward, resting his elbows on the arms of his chair, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He decided to raise the stakes. "All right," he said, his voice growing sharper. "Translate this." He uttered a phrase, one that twisted with idioms, cultural references, and layered meaning. A phrase even some professional translators struggled to capture accurately. He expected her to stumble, to hesitate, to falter. But she didn't. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, almost as if she were listening not just with her ears but with her heart. And then, with flawless rhythm, she translated the phrase, not just word for word, but essence for essence. She conveyed humor where there was humor, subtlety where there was subtlety, irony where irony was hidden. When she finished, the room erupted. Not with laughter this time, but with applause. Genuine, thunderous applause that filled the walls and shook the chandelier above them. The millionaire's smile vanished completely. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles turning white. He hadn't expected applause. He hadn't expected admiration to shift away from him and land squarely on the maid. This was his home, his audience, his stage. And yet, he was no longer the star of the evening. The maid bowed her head slightly, not in arrogance but in respect for the moment. And then she returned to silence, as if the applause was not hers to own but simply a passing storm. That humility struck even harder than her skill. Now, let me pause for a second and tell you something important. You see, this story isn't just about a translation contest. It's about how quickly tables can turn when someone underestimated finds their voice. How many times have you been in a situation where someone doubted you, looked down on you, or dismissed you without giving you a chance? And how many times have you dreamed of proving them wrong in the most unexpected way? That's exactly what's happening here. And if you're feeling that spark right now, if this story is stirring something inside you, don't just sit back and let it pass. Take a second, subscribe to this channel, tap the like button, and share this video with someone who's ever been underestimated. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you surprised someone who doubted you. Your story might inspire thousands of others. All right, let's get back to the maid and the millionaire. The applause eventually subsided, but the tension did not. The millionaire forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow, brittle. "You're clever," he admitted reluctantly. "But cleverness won't get you far in the real world. Translation is one thing, survival is another." The maid finally allowed herself a faint smile. "Maybe so," she said softly. "But tonight you offered your salary for a translation. And I accepted." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. She hadn't forgotten his words. She hadn't allowed his arrogance to slip into the shadows. She was holding him accountable right there in front of everyone. The millionaire's eyes darkened. For the first time in years, he felt cornered, not by wealth, not by power, but by truth. He tried to dismiss it, waving his hand as if brushing away smoke. "That was a joke," he snapped. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They had heard him clearly. They had laughed with him when he made the offer. And now they were watching to see if he would honor his word. The maid stood tall, her hands still folded calmly in front of her. She didn't demand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her silence more powerful than any argument. And in that silence, the millionaire realized something terrifying. He was losing control. The weight of silence pressed down on the room like a heavy curtain. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the millionaire, waiting for his response. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a thin line of lips that trembled ever so slightly. For the first time that evening, he wasn't the one in control. He rose slowly from his chair, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The applause from earlier still seemed to echo in his mind, taunting him, reminding him that the spotlight had shifted. He cleared his throat and forced a smile, trying to regain his composure. "Well," he said, his voice strained, "perhaps I spoke too soon. Perhaps I underestimated you." The maid didn't respond. She simply stood there, her presence calm, unyielding, like a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. Her silence said everything. "You made a promise. Everyone heard it. Now what will you do?" The guests exchanged glances. Some were amused, others uncomfortable. A few whispered, "Will he really give her his salary?" The murmurs spread like wildfire, filling the space with tension. The millionaire could feel the pressure building, and for the first time, wealth didn't seem like a shield. Felt like a weight dragging him down. Finally, he laughed. A short, sharp laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "All right," he said. "You're clever. I'll give you that. But money isn't won with tricks. It's earned through experience, through discipline, through vision. Do you even know what it means to manage a fortune? To be responsible for millions?" The maid tilted her head. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But tonight wasn't about managing millions. Tonight was about words. And you put a price on them." Her answer struck him harder than he expected. Words. They had always been his tool, used to negotiate, to command, to impress. But tonight, words had betrayed him. They had slipped from his tongue like careless sparks, and she had caught them, turned them into fire, and lit the entire room with them. He felt cornered, and people who feel cornered often fight back. He straightened his shoulders and said, "Fine. You want my salary? Then prove you deserve it. Translate this." He rattled off a passage in another language, one heavy with technical jargon and cultural nuance. It wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was a challenge designed to break her confidence. The maid closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she began to speak. Her voice flowed with precision, each word carrying weight, each sentence shaped with care. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She didn't just translate. She transformed. What he had thrown at her like a weapon, she turned into a bridge, making the meaning clear even to those who didn't know the original language. When she finished, the room erupted again, this time with cheers. Not polite applause, but genuine, unrestrained cheering. People rose from their chairs, clapping, laughing in disbelief. Some shouted her name, though most didn't even know it yet. She had gone from invisible to unforgettable in the span of a few minutes. The millionaire's face turned pale. He couldn't mask it anymore. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked less like a man of power and more like a boy caught in his own lie. And then came the final blow. The maid, still calm, still collected, looked him in the eyes and said, "You asked me to translate, and I did. Twice. The room agrees. Now, will you keep your word?" The crowd roared. The tension reached its peak. It was no longer about translation, it was about honor, dignity, and truth. The millionaire could feel every eye on him, burning, demanding. He had built his empire on the illusion of control, but in this moment, control had slipped through his fingers. Now, before I reveal how he reacted, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next, let me remind you of something. Stories like this remind us why we crave justice, why we root for the underdog, why we cheer when someone unexpected rises against arrogance. If you're enjoying this story, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment with one word: respect. Because that's exactly what this maid just earned. All right, back to it. The millionaire tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked in his throat. His carefully constructed image of control was crumbling. He looked at the crowd, at the faces waiting for his decision. And for the first time in years, he realized that money couldn't save him from accountability. The maid stood silently, not demanding, not pressing, just waiting. Her stillness was louder than any voice, and as the millionaire's pride wrestled with his fear, everyone knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. The moment that would define the night had finally arrived. The millionaire's fingers tapped nervously against the polished surface of the table. For a man who was used to commanding boardrooms, silencing critics, and bending situations to his will, this was a nightmare. Every second of silence stretched like an eternity, and the crowd's anticipation only grew heavier. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his mind racing with excuses, strategies, anything to escape this trap of his own making. He could feel sweat forming at his temples, though the room was perfectly cool. Finally, he forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "surely you all understand that this was never meant to be serious. It was just a bit of fun. A joke, nothing more." But the crowd didn't laugh with him this time. They exchanged glances, shaking their heads, murmuring. The same people who had once admired his charm and charisma now saw through the facade. He wasn't joking. They had all heard the arrogance in his challenge. And now they wanted to see if he would live up to it. The maid didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply stood, her gaze fixed, her silence a mirror reflecting his cowardice. That silence hurt more than words ever could. It was the silence of truth, the kind that makes excuses sound hollow. One of the guests, emboldened by the moment, spoke up. "You said it yourself," he reminded. "You promised your salary. We all heard it. Are you really going to break your word?" Others nodded, whispering their agreement. The pressure intensified. The millionaire's jaw tightened, his smile fading completely. He was cornered, not by wealth, not by contracts, but by his own arrogance. And everyone knew it. The maid finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "You built your life on promises," she said. "Business deals, investments, contracts. Your word is supposed to mean something. Tonight, it means everything." Her words cut deeper than any blade. They weren't just for him. They were for everyone listening. And the crowd leaned in, hungry for justice, desperate to see the mighty held accountable. The millionaire's eyes darted from face to face. He saw no sympathy, no escape. He could feel the weight of his empire pressing down on him, and for the first time he understood the fragility of power. It wasn't built on money alone. It was built on trust, on perception. And both were slipping away. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. His hand trembled as he scribbled a signature onto a check. He tore it from the book and held it out toward the maid. "Take it," he said, his voice low, almost defeated. "1 month's salary." Gasps filled the room. The crowd leaned forward, shocked that he would actually do it. But the maid didn't move to take the check. She simply looked at it, then back at him. "That's not what you said," she replied softly. The crowd erupted again. Laughter, cheers, disbelief. She was right. He hadn't offered a month's salary. He had said, "my salary." His words, his promise. And she wasn't going to let him twist them now. The millionaire's face flushed crimson. His hand shook as he pulled the check back. He scribbled again, this time writing a figure so large that a few of the guests gasped just at the sight of it. It wasn't just a token. It was life-changing. He slammed the check down on the table in front of her. "There," he said harshly. "Satisfied?" The maid stepped forward at last, her movements graceful, unhurried. She picked up the check, glanced at it, then folded it neatly and tucked it away. "I didn't do this for money," she said quietly. "I did it because you thought I couldn't, because you thought I was invisible. But now you see me." Her words struck the crowd like thunder. Some clapped, some cheered, but all of them understood. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about courage, about proving that brilliance can come from the most unexpected places. The millionaire slumped back into his chair, his empire intact but his pride shattered. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. Now, before we move into the twist that no one in that room saw coming, let me remind you, if you've stayed with me this far, you're hooked. And if you're hooked, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe right now, drop a like to show your support for stories that flip the script, and leave a comment below with the word justice, because that's exactly what unfolded here tonight. Alright, let's continue. The maid stood quietly, the check folded in her pocket, but the power in her presence filled the room. And just when everyone thought the story had reached its end, something happened that changed everything again. For a long beat, nobody moved. The check was in her pocket, but the real currency in the room was attention, every last drop of it fixed on the maid. Then she did something no one expected. She asked for a chair. Not the upholstered thrones near the fireplace, not a spotlighted perch, just a plain wooden chair from the corner. She set it in the center of the room, sat, and folded her hands. The gesture was disarmingly simple, almost intimate, like she was about to tell a story to friends around a kitchen table. "I'll keep this short," she began, though her voice had the steadiness of someone who planned to tell the truth for as long as it took. "You asked me to translate. I did, twice. But there's something you should all know about translation. It doesn't only carry meaning across languages. It carries responsibility across people." A murmur swept the room. The millionaire shifted, already irritated by the suggestion that he owed anything beyond the ink on the check. "Responsibility?" he scoffed. "For a party trick?" She shook her head. "Not a trick. A pattern." She reached into her apron and pulled out a worn phone, the screen spiderwebbed with tiny cracks. "You love to speak about your global vision," she said, eyes on the millionaire. "Your expansion. Your speeches about bridges between cultures. I've heard them, well, not in this room. In my headphones at 2 in the morning, after cleaning the last glass." The crowd stilled again. "I freelance at night," she continued, "for an agency you use. You didn't know my name because I signed my work with initials, LL. I translated your investor memo for the Santiago deal, the open letter you posted after the Prague conference, and the apology you issued when a campaign missed the mark in Mexico City. The phrasing you loved? The idioms the press praised you for? I wrote them. I made you sound human when it mattered." A collective inhale. Several guests looked to the millionaire, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything. He stared at her, stunned, the veneer of control slipping like rain off glass. "Impossible," he said, but it sounded more like a wish than a statement. "My team handles that." "Your team forwarded a rush job with a 12-hour deadline," she replied softly. The subject line was, "Urgent, Latin launch keynote. Need warmth without weakness." "Do you remember your closing line? We don't sell products. We translate needs into dignity." You delivered that sentence to a standing ovation. She let the silence expand. "I translated that sentence into existence." A man near the window whispered, "No way." But there was no mockery in it, only awe. Another guest, a woman from the press, frowned in astonishment. "I quoted that line," she said under her breath, as if confessing to a priest. The millionaire's mouth opened and closed. He looked smaller somehow, not because his suit had shrunk, but because the scaffolding of borrowed eloquence had been gently wheeled away. If that were true," he managed, "why say nothing? Why mop floors after writing my words?" "Because nighttime work paid for my mother's medication," she said plainly. "Because a name on a slide can't buy groceries. Because I wanted to learn from this house how power moves, how rooms like these breathe. And because I was waiting for the right question." Her gaze held him. "Tonight you asked it." No one dared cough. No glass clinked. Even the chandelier seemed to steady itself. She stood, the chair legs whispering against the floor. "About the check," she said. "I'll deposit it tomorrow. Not for me. For classes, language, law, negotiation. For every invisible worker on this staff who wants them." We'll call it the Unseen Scholars Fund. And you, she nodded at the millionaire, you'll match every donation for a year. That's the translation I want from you. Convert applause into opportunity. It landed like thunder and then lightning. Applause cracked open. Not polite this time, but fierce, grateful, almost protective. People rose to their feet. A few had tears in their eyes, and it wasn't sentimentality. It was recognition. They weren't clapping for a miracle. They were clapping for a blueprint. The millionaire's face went through a quiet weather system. Shock, resistance, calculation, and finally something that looked suspiciously like honesty. He rubbed his temples, then laughed once, short, rueful. You really did write that line, he murmured. Warmth without weakness. He lifted his chin. Fine, I'll match it. For a year. He paused, swallowed. And I'll do something else. His voice steadied. You're right. I've built a brand on borrowed voices. You gave me one when mine would have failed. So here's my promise, on record. My next keynote will credit the translators, interpreters, and writers whose craft carries meaning through walls money can't cross. Starting with you, LL. A wave of sound rolled through the room. Applause, cheers, even a few laughs of disbelief. The maid LL didn't bask. She simply nodded, as if checking a box on a long list, then turned to the staff lining the doorway. We start Monday, she said with a small smile. Bring notebooks. Now, quick pit stop with you. Yes, you watching this. If this turn gave you goosebumps, if it made you think about the voices behind the spotlight, take 2 seconds and subscribe. Hit like so the algorithm doesn't bury stories like this, and comment one word, visibility. Your comment tells the platform this message matters, and it helps us fund more stories that translate applause into action. Back in the room, the party soundtrack resumed, softer, humbler. Conversations shifted. Deals were still discussed, numbers still traded, but something in the air had changed registers. The maid walked toward the exit, not fleeing the scene but moving through it like someone who finally fit the coordinates of her own map. People stopped her to thank her, to ask about the fund, to offer help, space for classes, old laptops, introductions. She accepted with grace and an economy of words, as translators do. At the threshold, she looked back once. The millionaire stood alone for a moment, staring at the chair she'd placed in the center of his kingdom. Then he did something he wasn't famous for. He listened to the quiet. And for the first time, it seemed to say something he could actually understand. The days that followed were unlike anything the mansion had ever seen. For years, its walls had echoed with laughter from lavish dinners, hollow speeches about vision, and the quiet resignation of those who served. But now, something new pulsed through the corridors, possibility. Word of the maid's stand spread like wildfire. At first, it was whispers among staff, then murmurs in the city, and soon headlines across continents. Millionaire outwitted by Maid translator. Invisible no more. The woman who made a tycoon pay his word. Social media devoured the story, dissecting every phrase, every look, every silence that night. Clips of her final statement, convert applause into opportunity, circulated like scripture. The millionaire hated the attention at first. He locked himself away, furious that his image had been dented, that his empire was now tethered to a narrative he didn't write. But slowly, begrudgingly, he realized something. For once, people weren't mocking him. They weren't dismissing him. They were watching him, waiting to see if he would actually honor his promise. His empire's stock had always risen and fallen with perception, and now perception demanded accountability. Meanwhile, the maid LL was no longer invisible. Invitations arrived daily. Interviews, panels, even offers from publishing houses wanting her to write her story. She declined most of them. The work matters more than the spotlight, she told anyone who asked. Instead, she focused on the fund she had announced. The Unseen Scholars Fund launched quietly in the staff kitchen, with a second-hand whiteboard and a dozen mismatched chairs. By the end of the first week, 30 names filled the list. Cooks, cleaners, drivers, gardeners, all signing up for classes. The millionaire showed up, too. Not with cameras, not with speeches, just with a notebook. He sat in the back row, awkward in his tailored suit, trying to blend in. At first, the staff eyed him with suspicion, but Ella welcomed him with a nod. "Translation begins with listening," she said, and handed him a battered dictionary. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. One evening, after a session on negotiation basics, he lingered while others left. "Why help me?" he asked her quietly. "After everything?" She looked at him, not unkindly. "Because if I don't, you'll just repeat the same mistake with someone else. And because real translation isn't about words, it's about turning arrogance into understanding." He chuckled bitterly. "Then I was a whole book in the wrong language." "Maybe," she said with a small smile. "But every book can be translated if you're patient enough." The mansion's atmosphere shifted. Guests who once came for spectacle now came with curiosity. Investors wanted to meet the maid who had humbled a millionaire. Journalists came hoping for scandal, but left with stories of resilience and redemption. And slowly the narrative evolved. The arrogant tycoon was learning, not because he wanted to, but because someone demanded it of him and because the world was watching. But LL wasn't content with one victory. She expanded the fund, partnering with schools, libraries, and community centers. What began as classes for staff became workshops across neighborhoods. Soon, hundreds were learning languages, law, and leadership, skills that cracked open doors previously locked shut. And yet, through it all, she never stopped working her shifts. "The day I forget where I started," she told her colleagues, "is the day I stop translating reality." Now let me pause here for a second, because this part of the story isn't just about them. It's about us. How many times have we seen power overlook talent? How many times have brilliant voices been hidden because no one asked the right question? If you're still watching, if this resonates with you, then do me one favor. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button so stories like this don't vanish in the algorithm, and leave a comment with one phrase, "Never invisible." Because that's the lesson she carried, and it's the lesson we should all carry. Back in the mansion, the millionaire faced a new challenge: humility. He found it harder than any business deal. Numbers bent to his will, humility did not. He struggled, stumbled, but he kept showing up. Some nights he stayed late after classes, asking LL questions, scribbling notes like a schoolboy. One night, as the group packed up, he said softly, "You know, that night, when you stood up to me, you ruined me." LL raised an eyebrow. "Ruined?" "Yes," he said. "The old me, the version that thought money meant invincibility. That man's gone. And maybe that's the best thing that's ever happened." For the first time, she smiled. Not the polite nod of a teacher, not the calm restraint of a translator, but a real smile. "Then the translation worked," she said. And just like that, the room, once filled with arrogance, was filled with understanding. Months passed, and the mansion was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It had become something else entirely. Where once the halls had echoed with empty laughter and hollow boasts, now they buzzed with conversations in new languages, debates over ethics, and the quiet scratching of pens on paper. The Unseen Scholars Fund had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Journalists started calling it the House of Translation. But as the project flourished, cracks began to show in places no one anticipated. It started small. Anonymous letters slipped under the kitchen door, scrawled with accusations. "She's not who she says she is. Ask her about her past." At first, the staff dismissed them as jealousy, the kind of resentment that success often sparks. But the letters kept coming. One evening, after class, the millionaire approached LL with one in his hand. "Do you know about this?" he asked, his voice cautious. She glanced at it, then looked him in the eye. "Yes." The answer was so calm it rattled him. "Yes? That's it." She folded her apron neatly, her movements precise. "Rumors have a way of finding me. They always have." He hesitated. "Are they true?" Her silence stretched long enough to make him uneasy. "Truth," she finally said, "depends on which part of the story you're willing to hear." The millionaire didn't push further, but the doubt gnawed at him, pulling at the fragile foundation of his newfound humility. Meanwhile, the press began to dig. The The story of the Maid-turned-translator had been too perfect, too inspiring. Now they wanted flaws, contradictions, anything to break the myth. They uncovered fragments. A year unaccounted for on her resume, a name change, whispers of connections to causes that made governments uncomfortable. The headlines shifted from heroine to mystery. At the next gathering in the mansion, the tension was palpable. The guests weren't just there to celebrate her achievements. They were there to test her. Questions came sharp and fast. Where were you 5 years ago? Is LL even your real name? Why did you really take this job? The millionaire watched, torn between defending her and fearing what the answers might be. But LL didn't flinch. She stood at the center, the same way she had the night of the challenge, and said, "You want my past because it makes you comfortable. You want a neat story. Poor Maid, hidden genius, discovered by accident. But life doesn't work in neat stories. I've lived in shadows, yes. I've worked under names that weren't mine. I've written words that leaders spoke without ever knowing who crafted them. Does that make me less real? Or does it make me exactly what I claim to be? A translator? Someone who carries meaning across borders, across disguises, across silence." The room froze. No one had expected her to embrace the accusations rather than deny them. But then she leaned forward, her gaze sharper than ever. "And if my story makes you uncomfortable, ask yourselves why. Is it because I cleaned floors while writing speeches? Or is it because you need me to stay small in order for your world to feel big?" The silence that followed was electric. The millionaire's chest tightened. He realized then that she wasn't just challenging him anymore. She was challenging everyone. The same arrogance he had once embodied lived in the crowd too, in their assumptions, in their hunger for control over her narrative. And she was dismantling it piece by piece. Afterward, when the guests dispersed, some shaken, some inspired, the millionaire found her alone in the library, tracing her finger along the spines of books in languages he couldn't read. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. She turned to him. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. You wanted a miracle made, a story you could package. But I'm not a package. I'm a person, complicated, imperfect, and real." He sank into a chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "And now, she said, "you have to decide if you want to keep building a house of translation or if you only wanted the fairy tale." For the first time, he didn't have an answer. The next morning, the library felt different, as if the books themselves had inched closer, eager to listen. LL arrived before sunrise, opened the curtains, and let a column of pale light fall across the long table. She placed a folder in the center, unmarked, thin, careful. When the millionaire walked in, he looked at it like it might explode. "You wanted the truth," she said. "Here's the portion I can give you without risking someone else's life." He didn't sit. "Someone else's?" She nodded. "I wasn't always cleaning floors and moonlighting as a translator for corporate decks. Years ago, I worked with a small, stubborn network called Borderless Words. No logos, no press page. We translated testimonies. People fleeing violence. Workers trapped by contracts they couldn't read. Whistleblowers trying to describe what was happening inside facilities where cameras weren't allowed. We moved meaning across borders so people could be believed in rooms designed to doubt them." He swallowed. "That missing year the papers keep poking at. Courtrooms, safe houses, midnight buses. Names I borrowed for a week at a time." She tapped the folder. "And one trial that changed everything. The prosecution had a translator who turned nuance into quicksand, flattened dialect into inconsistency. A boy was about to be deported because a verb was mishandled, because fear doesn't conjugate neatly. I corrected the record. The judge allowed it. The boy stayed. After that, someone decided I shouldn't translate anything ever again, at least not with my real name." He finally sat. The chair creaked under a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. "That's why you changed identities. That's why I learned to be invisible on purpose," she said. "It's easier to carry other people's voices when no one is scanning your face for a headline." He opened the folder. Inside, copies of sworn affidavits with thick black bars, emails from community lawyers begging for rush translations, a single photograph, blurred, of a waiting room with a crooked clock and a row of children's backpacks. His jaw clicked. And the governments that felt uncomfortable? "I'm not a revolutionary," she said, almost amused. "I'm a sentence mechanic, but sentences rearrange lives. Power prefers its paperwork docile." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "And me? Where do I fit in this?" "You threw a dare into a room and expected it to bounce off the walls," she said softly. "It hit someone who knows what a dare like that can cost the wrong person. I didn't stand up to embarrass you. I stood up so the room would learn a better reflex." Silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recalculation. He exhaled through his nose, a small surrender. "The press won't like any of this." "They don't have to," she said. "They only have to get used to it." By afternoon, the mansion hosted its largest class yet. Staff, neighbors, a nurse from the clinic down the hill, a grocer who wanted to read contracts without squinting at the fine print. LL wrote 3 words on the board: audience, intent, risk. "Every message," she said, "travels with these 3 passengers. If you don't account for all of them, your meaning crashes on arrival." The millionaire stood in the back, taking notes like a man cramming for a test he should have taken years ago. When the session ended, a well-known investor stepped from the doorway, all perfect teeth and weatherproof charm. "Impressive turnout," he said, "but let's talk optics. Some clients are skittish about your history." He didn't look at LL when he said it. He looked at the millionaire. "Distance your brand from activism. Keep the fund. Sure, but keep it cute. Scholarships, photo ops, nothing messy. Or I pull." The room chilled. LL didn't blink. "Messy is where truth lives." The investor smiled like a scalpel. "Nobody buys truth. They buy certainty." The millionaire glanced between them, the old reflex tugging hard. Protect the numbers, soothe the board, find a middle ground that doesn't exist. His pen hovered over a blank page. LL didn't step closer. She didn't need to. "This is the first real test," she said. "Translation or packaging. Which house are you building?" He closed his notebook. "If I choose you, we lose him," he said under his breath. "If you choose him," she answered, "you lose yourself, and everyone who finally believed you could change." He rubbed his eyes. The investor kept talking, parroting phrases the millionaire had once loved: brand integrity, stakeholder comfort, controlled narratives. They suddenly sounded like an elevator pitch in a burning building. "Give me 48 hours, the millionaire said at last. "You'll have 24, the investor replied. "Markets move." When the man left, the quiet returned, vibrating like a wire. LL erased the board slowly. "You can't outnegotiate a void," she said. "You fill it with a decision." He laughed once, hollow. "Do I get a glossary for this part?" "Only a compass." She handed him a card with a single line printed on it: warmth without weakness. He smiled despite himself. "You keep receipts." "I keep promises," she said. "Now, quick breather with you watching. If this deeper layer, activism, stakes, real costs, hits home, don't just lurk. Subscribe so you don't miss the next turn. Like to keep this story alive in the feed, and comment the phrase meaning over optics. That's the question hanging over our characters, and maybe over us. Night fell. The mansion's lights came on one by one, a constellation stitched onto stone. In his office, the millionaire drafted 2 letters. One to the investor, clean and final. One to his board, risk mapped, upside framed, spine intact. Downstairs, LL sorted donated laptops, tested chargers, labeled cables, building a classroom out of stubbornness and string. Just before midnight, he found her in the kitchen, steam rising from mugs of tea. "I made my decision," he said. She didn't ask what it was. She just pushed a mug toward him and waited for the translation to arrive in its own time. The next morning, the investor returned expecting compliance. He walked into the mansion with the air of someone who had already won, his shoes clicking like punctuation marks on the marble floor. The board members followed close behind, their expressions tight with anticipation. The millionaire was waiting in the main hall, a folder tucked under his arm. He didn't offer the usual charm or practiced grin. Instead, he gestured toward the dining table where a single sheet of paper lay in the center. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "I want to be clear. I've made my choice." The investor raised an eyebrow, lips twitching with arrogance. "Good. Then we can move forward." He reached for the paper, but it wasn't a contract of compliance. It was a resignation letter. His resignation from the investor's portfolio, effective immediately. The room fell into stunned silence. "You can't be serious," the investor scoffed. "You're walking away from millions?" The millionaire folded his hands, steady now, not trembling. "I'm walking away from certainty that suffocates truth. If that costs millions, so be it. But I've seen what packaging without meaning creates. Empty applause, hollow headlines. I won't build another empire on that." The investor's face twisted, the confidence cracking into fury. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," the millionaire said softly, "but regret is lighter than hypocrisy." He slid the letter closer. "Our partnership ends today." The board erupted into chaos, half of them shouting about fiduciary duty, the other half whispering about reputation. Yet in the midst of the noise, a few faces showed something else: relief. They had felt the hollow grind of the old ways too, but never dared to voice it. Now, the decision gave them permission to breathe differently. Upstairs, LL listened from the landing. She didn't smile, but her eyes held a glimmer of recognition. It wasn't victory. It was translation, arrogance into humility, calculation into courage. Later that day, reporters camped outside the gates. The headlines were immediate. Millionaire breaks with investors after Maid's challenge. From arrogance to accountability? The translator who changed the boardroom. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded, and the mansion that once stood for indulgence now symbolized upheaval. In the evening, during the scholars' class, the millionaire entered late, jacket off, tie loosened. He looked less like a titan of finance and more like a student who'd been scolded by the day. He waited until the lesson ended before speaking. "Today I chose risk over optics," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "But risk feels different when it's tethered to purpose. You showed me that." He looked at LL directly. "You've been teaching me translations I never thought I'd need, the language of accountability, the dialect of humility, and maybe the hardest one, the grammar of starting over." The staff clapped, not out of obligation but out of recognition. They had seen him laugh at their expense, and now they saw him learning at their side. It didn't erase the past, but it translated it into a future that looked less impossible. But just as the atmosphere began to settle, another shock arrived. The press wasn't finished digging. That night, a major outlet published an exposé claiming that Borderless Words, the group LL admitted working with, had been flagged by multiple governments as subversive. The article framed her as more than a translator. It hinted at espionage, of coded messages hidden inside testimonies, of entire operations disguised as language work. The next morning, the mansion gates were swarmed again, not with admiration but with suspicion. Reporters shouted accusations, cameras zoomed in on her face, headlines painted her as a mastermind in the shadows. Translator or traitor? One blared across front pages. The millionaire met her in the study, newspaper in hand. His jaw was tight, but his eyes betrayed something deeper: fear, yes, but also loyalty being tested. "Is any of this true?" he asked. She didn't flinch. "Some of it. Not the espionage. But yes, testimonies can be dangerous. Words can expose what governments want buried. They'll call it subversive because it shakes their scaffolding." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Then they'll come after you." "They already are," she said simply. "And by extension, me." Her gaze softened. "You wanted translation. This is what it costs. You can still walk away." He shook his head slowly. "No. If I walk now, I'll prove every accusation that I only ever stood for myself." Outside, Chants from protesters and supporters alike echoed in clashing rhythms. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a stage for a battle over truth, meaning, and power. LL closed the curtains, shutting out the noise. "Then brace yourself," she whispered. "The hardest translation hasn't started yet." By sunrise, the story had detonated beyond the gates. 2 panels on morning TV argued over LL's real agenda, while a third tried to psychoanalyze the Millionaire's sudden moral awakening. Government spokespeople gave careful statements that sounded like they'd been translated twice and drained of meaning. Meanwhile, hashtags stormed the feeds. Hashtag translator or traitor and hashtag unseen scholars trended side by side like rival banners flapping in the same wind. Inside the mansion, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Lawyers, PR firms, old friends who started calling him Buddy. Again, now that a camera might be pointed their way. The board wanted a crisis plan. The staff wanted to know if the classes would continue. LL wanted a whiteboard, a marker, and 5 minutes with whoever was actually listening. "War of narratives," she said, drawing a triangle. "Audience, intent, risk, same passengers, bigger vehicle." She tapped the top point, audience. "They're not just viewers now. They're jurors and amplifiers." She tapped intent. "Yours must be clear enough to survive distortion. Then risk. And you have to pay the toll up front, or the road will take it from you later." The Millionaire nodded, eyes tired but awake. "So how do we drive?" "Not with press releases," she said. "With receipts." The first volley hit before noon. A slick documentary-style hit piece claiming borderless words had funneled coded directives through dual-language pamphlets. It spliced LL's class clips with ominous music, paired her calm explanations with archival footage of protests, and ended on a freeze frame of her face while a baritone warned, "Meaning can be weaponized." The piece racked up 1 million views in an hour. LL watched it once without blinking. "They're seeding a frame where translation equals subversion," she said. "Classic move. Poison the tool to discredit the message." "What's our counter?" the Millionaire asked. 2 steps, she said. 1. Unmask the pipeline who paid for this and why. 2. Invite the public into the workshop. Show the gears. Turn mystery into method. He stared. "A live class. A live audit," she corrected. "Open source accountability. If we hide, we confirm their story. If we open the doors, we force them to argue with facts." By afternoon, the mansion's ballroom had been converted into a studio. 3 cameras, lav mics, a projector, rows of chairs filled with staff, students, neighbors. The Millionaire posted a 2-line announcement. "Open class tonight. Translation, testimony, and truth. All welcome." Streamed live. The comments exploded, skeptics, supporters, trolls, journalists. Before going on, he hovered by the curtain. "If this backfires," he muttered, "we don't get a second swing." LL adjusted her mic. "Then make the first one honest." The stream cut in. No dramatic intro, no voiceover. Just LL at a whiteboard and the Millionaire in the second row with a notebook. "Good evening," she began. "You've heard a lot about me. You've heard more about my supposed motives than about my actual work. So we'll do this the simple way. I'll show you exactly how we handle testimony when someone's future depends on the accuracy of a verb." She projected anonymized excerpts. Regional idioms that would collapse into nonsense if translated literally. A sentence whose meaning flipped based on a particle. A phrase that, in one dialect, meant, "I went," and in another, "I was taken." She walked viewers through choices, uncertainties, footnotes. She let silence hold when an answer required nuance. No drama, no spin, just craft. Then she flipped the script. "Now let's analyze the documentary about me." She froze a frame, zoomed into metadata, traced the production company to a shell firm that shared an address with a lobbying outfit representing the ex-investor's largest client. She pulled up donation networks, procurement logs, email leaks already in the public domain but never stitched together. "Packaging," she said, circling a timeline. "Not journalism." The chat went feral. "Wait, what? Source? She has links. This is wild." A few skeptics stayed skeptical, but their talking points looked smaller when parked next to footnotes. The millionaire felt something settle in his chest that wasn't relief so much as alignment. He raised his hand, not as host, not as savior, but as a student. Could you show how warmth without weakness would break if translated carelessly? She smiled, wrote 3 clumsy versions on the board, then the one that landed, and explained why each word mattered. The room laughed, not at her, not at him, but at the shared recognition that meaning really could be engineered with empathy and spine. Midstream, a new headline flashed across feeds. Leaked memo ties investor-funded PAC to anti-translator campaign. The chat detonated. Alel didn't gloat. She simply scrawled 2 words on the board. Follow incentives. Now, quick pause with you watching this unfold in real time. If transparency like this is the antidote you came for, subscribe so you don't miss the next session, like so the platform doesn't bury it, and comment 2 words, open workshop. That's how we keep this conversation where it belongs. Out in the open. Back on stream, a caller patched in. A woman with a steady voice and a scar just visible near her temple. She spoke from a shelter across the border about paperwork she couldn't decipher. About the night a translator's correction kept her from signing away custody of her son. I don't know politics, she said. I know that words saved my life. The room fell quiet. The chat filled with the only emoji that made sense. A flood of hearts. Not as performative pity, but as a pulse. The feed ran 2 hours. When it ended, the mansion exhaled. Outside, the protests thinned. People had gone home to argue at their kitchen tables instead of on the sidewalk. The hit piece kept circulating, sure, but every share now had a counterlink attached. The workshop, the receipts, the faces. That night, the millionaire stood alone in the ballroom. Lights dimmed, whiteboard still smudged with ink. You realize, he said as LL entered, this isn't the end of it. It never is, she replied, setting the markers in a neat row. But we've translated the battlefield. They wanted shadows. We turned on the lights. He grinned. Tired, a little wrecked, but real. What's next? Next, she said. We teach them the hardest lesson of all. How to disagree in good faith. She tapped the board lightly. Audience. Intent. Risk. Same passengers. New road. And as the mansion settled into a fragile, braver quiet, the world outside kept arguing. Louder in some places, softer in others. But now, at least, some of the noise had shape. By the end of that week, the world wasn't just watching, they were participating. The open workshop had sparked something unexpected. A movement. Universities began hosting translation nights, where students dissected political speeches line by line, checking them against the source texts. Community centers set up language circles where neighbors compared dialects over tea. Even late-night comedians picked up the story, joking about millionaires needing homework help from their maids. But governments don't laugh when control slips. 3 days later, a summons arrived at the mansion. LL was ordered to testify before an international committee investigating linguistic manipulation. The language was vague, but the intent was sharp. They wanted to paint her not as a teacher or truth-teller, but as a destabilizer, someone whose words threatened order. The millionaire read the letter 3 times, each word heavier than the last. This isn't a trial, he muttered. It's a performance. They'll seat you in front of cameras, call you a threat, and hope the spectacle drowns your work. LL took the letter, folded it carefully, and set it aside. Then we prepare like translators always do. Context, precision, audience. The staff buzzed with worry, but she was calm. To her, the committee wasn't an ambush. It was another room that needed its reflexes corrected. Still, the risk loomed. Testimony could make her a global example, either of courage or of overreach. The day arrived. The hearing chamber was a theater disguised as law. Rows of delegates under flags, translators in glass booths, cameras perched like vultures. LL entered in her plain clothes, carrying nothing but a notebook. The millionaire walked behind her, not as her employer but as her witness. A delegate opened. You stand accused of undermining national narratives through selective translation. Do you deny this? LL leaned toward the mic. I deny that translation undermines. It reveals. If your narrative collapses when words are carried accurately, perhaps it wasn't sturdy to begin with. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The chairman frowned. You admit, then, to influencing public perception? Every translator does, she said. But influence is not the same as manipulation. Influence is gravity. Manipulation is a trapdoor. If you can't tell the difference, you're not listening, you're rehearsing. The millionaire watched the delegates shift uncomfortably. He realized something crucial. She wasn't defending herself. She was teaching them line by line like another open workshop, except this one was being live broadcast to millions. One delegate tried to corner her. You've worked under aliases. Isn't that evidence of deception? She didn't flinch. It's evidence of survival. When governments criminalize testimony, names become targets. Would you prefer I'd let silence do the work? The room hushed. Even the translators in the booths paused, as if weighing her words before passing them on. Back home, viewers flooded the stream. Some cheered, others raged, but no one was indifferent. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag truth on trial. Hashtag words matter. Hashtag let her speak. The millionaire sat rigid, every muscle coiled. He'd seen negotiations, hostile takeovers, boardroom betrayals. But he had never seen a single person bend an international chamber with nothing but clarity. When the session adjourned, reporters swarmed. One shouted, "Are you a spy?" Another, "Are you a savior?" LL stopped on the steps, faced the cameras and said, "Neither. I'm a translator. My job is not to make you comfortable. It's to make you understand." The clip went viral before they even reached the car. That night, the mansion's gates filled again. Not just with journalists, but with ordinary people holding candles, signs, and even dictionaries. Some were in languages the millionaire couldn't read, but the message was unmistakable. They were standing for the right to be heard, and for the woman who insisted meaning belonged to everyone. Inside, the millionaire poured himself a drink, hands shaking. "You know they won't stop here," he said. "You embarrassed them in their own theater. They'll double down." LL sipped her tea. "Then we double the light." He gave a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she replied. "It's just not easy." For the first time, he understood the difference. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of privilege. It had become something else entirely, a crossroads. Every day, people arrived carrying notebooks, laptops, old dictionaries with frayed spines. Some came to learn English, others Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic. A gardener practiced legal terms to contest a contract. A single mother rehearsed testimony for a custody case. A young waiter prepared for a scholarship interview abroad. Each story added another layer, another voice in the choir LL had built. The millionaire stood at the edge of these gatherings, still unsure of where he fit. But he showed up. He fetched water pitchers, rearranged chairs, sometimes even scribbled words on the board. Gone was the man who once laughed at a dare. In his place stood someone learning to listen, not to command. The world outside kept roaring, headlines, hearings, political maneuvers, but inside, meaning was being built brick by brick. And in time, the outside began to shift. Journalists who once hunted for scandal started attending the workshops, not as reporters but as students. Politicians who had mocked LL now borrowed her phrases to rally their own causes, sometimes clumsily, sometimes sincerely. Even the committee that had summoned her began to fracture under public pressure, half of its members admitting that translation was not the enemy but the map. One evening, after the last student left, the millionaire found LL in the kitchen again, washing cups. "You've changed the air," he said. She didn't look up. The air was always here. People just needed permission to breathe it. He leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "You could be anything now. A politician, an author, a leader." "I'm a translator," she replied, drying a cup. "That's enough." He smiled faintly. "And me?" She studied him for a long moment. "You're proof. Proof that arrogance can be translated into humility, that laughter meant to humiliate can turn into applause for someone else. You're not the hero of this story, but you are the footnote that points to one." He chuckled, But it wasn't bitter anymore. A footnote. I'll take it. Outside, the chants had softened. No longer protests, but songs, different languages blending together, not perfectly, but with effort, with intent. The mansion glowed like a lantern, not of wealth but of words. The millionaire realized something profound. He hadn't lost his empire. He had translated it. From numbers into names. From control into contribution. From salary into story. And as for LL, she remained exactly what she always had been. Invisible until necessary, ordinary until extraordinary. A voice carrying meaning across divides too wide for arrogance to cross. The night closed with quiet laughter in the kitchen. The kind that doesn't echo but stays close. Like a promise. And that is where this story leaves us. With a maid who was never just a maid, a millionaire who discovered humility in the face of truth, and a world that learned, if only for a moment, that translation is not just about language. It's about survival, dignity, and the courage to be understood.